What's up everyone? Welcome to my personal best of 2020 video. In this video, I'm going to share with y'all all the things that I've either discovered this year or found new or additional value in. And to be specific, that could be things that maybe weren't even released in 2020, but maybe I just discovered them for the first time. And I want to share that with y'all. I want to show you how I use these things. This is going to include things like plugins, virtual instruments, and mixing and mastering techniques. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so the very first topic we're going to jump into is virtual instruments. And if you're anyone like me who is, say, like a quote-unquote bedroom musician, you're going to be very familiar with virtual instruments. This is going to be things like using MIDI for your bass and your drums. And those are the very first two things that we're going to jump into. So for me, the best of drums that I've discovered so far, and I've tried Superior Drummer, Get Good Drums, I've tried a bunch of them, and the best of the best, at least that I've discovered and used so far, is GGD, or Get Good Drums, The Invasion. It is absolutely fantastic. There is a massive array of cymbals, toms, different snare drums, different kick drums. You can mix and match all the different combinations that that to your heart's desire, and it just works really, really well. And I really like that they have a double kick articulation that works really well for getting that realistic, fast double kick sound. And so GGD, The Invasion, takes the best of for me as far as drums go. All right, so the next up in virtual instruments is going to be bass. And now for a while, earlier this year when I started this channel, I was using the built-in stock Logic Pro bass, MIDI bass with the Logic Pro bass amp. And it got me some decent tones, but it was far from what I was really trying to get or what I really wanted. And shortly thereafter, I started hearing things about Submission Audio. Of course, I started getting the ads in my Insta feed and stuff like that. So I checked them out, immediately fell in love with Gin Bass. So that is going to be my best of 2020 as far as virtual instruments go for bass. Gin Bass takes it easily. It tunes all the way down to like C0, I think. And so you can get the ultra low tunings, and it just has a awesome tone. And you can even do things with like just get the direct output, the DI, and craft tones yourself, which is actually a bass tone that I have put together using the DI output of Gin Bass, and you'll hear that later in this video, so stick around. Okay, so the next category we're going to move into is guitar, and specifically that's going to be two categories, or subcategories rather. It's going to be amp sim and then impulse responses. So first up is amp sim, and I could not choose just one. There were some incredible amp sims that came out this year, and even some that came out 2019 that were on my top 5 list. But I narrowed it down to 2. And the 2 that I chose as my best of 2020 is going to be the STL Tones Amp Hub plugin, as well as the Neural DSP Omega Ampworks Granifier. And I know some may immediately think, what? The Granifier, sure, it's great, but there's other Neural DSP plugins that are more well-rounded, or maybe even sound better for the type of music that you like to play. But for me, these two take the cake. The STL Amp Hub is fantastic. They have some of my favorite pedals in there, like the Fortin 33. They just released in December an update which has the 5153 in it, and it is absolutely incredible sounding. And then the Neural DSP Omega Ampworks Granifier is a perfect recreation of the Granifier, and it sounds so amazing, especially when paired with some of the impulse responses that I'm about to go into. But overall, these two absolutely were fantastic. They are the 2 amp sims that I've used the most this year by far, and so I just couldn't choose one. So these two are my best of amp sims for 2020. All right, and so moving on, as I've already hinted to, the next subcategory for guitar is going to be impulse responses. And Now, anyone who's familiar with working with amp sims, they usually ship with some pretty decent impulse responses, which can kind of get you going quickly. But if you're someone like me, you want to tinker. You want the ability to play with some different impulse responses, because that's really where you're able to truly kind of craft your own tone and really kind of customize things and help an amp or an amp tone fit into a mix better, right? And so that's where I started playing with some things and tinkering, and tried GGD, or Get Good Drums Zilla, Studio Cab Zilla, and immediately fell in love with it. They are fantastic IRs. Anyone who follows Misha on Instagram knows he uses it on everything these days that he's doing. I know he's been reamping a lot of stuff for an upcoming Bulb album, and everything that he's reamping is going through Studio Cab Zilla. And it all sounds fantastic. It sounds amazing. These are absolutely amazing IRs, captured by Nolly, of course. And so the next impulse response that I wanted to mention is something I was more recently turned on to or discovered, which is the Bogren Digital Rhythm IR Pack. And these are IRs that were pulled or captured by Jens Bogren, and they are from actual like contexts or actual mixes that he's done with some amazing bands, such as like Opeth, Soilwork, stuff like that. So I figured, let me give this thing a try, and they are fantastic. They're amazing. They're already kind of some of them are already pre-EQ'd, and so they are almost kind of like drop-in ready. And again, in some of the audio samples that you'll hear later in this video, you're going to hear these IRs, and they're fantastic. I actually just recently put a video out on these IRs, so if you haven't seen that, go check it out, and you'll hear some more additional audio samples of those IRs in that video. All right, so the next category we're going to jump into is mixing and mastering. And while I am not going to sit here and claim to be a professional mixing engineer or a mastering engineer, I will say that these are two things that I aspire to learn a lot more, and I want to grow my skills in both of these areas. And so I've been watching a lot of videos, I've been reading a lot of articles and studying on a lot of different techniques and tools that you can use to improve your mixes and your mastering. And so I want to share that with y'all now. And so the first subcategory under mixing and mastering we're going to talk about is plugins, right? Because if you're again, someone like me, you don't have a massive, $200,000, $250,000 studio at your disposal. So you have to use what you have available to you. And for me, that's plugins. And so I have taken advantage of companies like Plugin Alliance and Brainworks to use some of their like hardware modeling plugins. Slate Digital for the same type of thing, hardware modeling. And so without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump into the plugins that I have really found to be kind of the best of the best for mixing this year, mixing and mastering, really. So the very first one is the Black Box Analog Design HG2. And this is a like a saturation plugin, a tube saturation, and it is absolutely fantastic. And I'll pull it up on the screen here. Let's see, it is right here. And this is from Plugin Alliance. And as you can see, you've got a few things you can play with here. So you can either affect the high end, a flat frequency response, or the low end. And then you have your overall saturation. You have an alt tube, which colors the saturation in a different way. And then your pentode and your triode. And the way that these work is the pentode actually affects the triode. So the higher you push the pentode, the more you're pushing that signal into the triode, and then goes to the output from there. And so it gives you a lot of ability to tweak the overall saturation and the color of the saturation and the harmonics. And you can also add this air function, which adds additional saturation and coloration and harmonics to the top end, right? Like the higher frequencies. And then, of course, you have your bypass. And overall, there's a lot more to it as well. There's density settings, and then you can adjust the mix, the input, etc. But I found this to be absolutely invaluable across things like drums, my main instrument mix bus, cymbals and rooms, toms, things like that, and it just adds this really beautiful coloration to things that you would really just lack in a mix without it. And so this is one of the best ones that I've discovered this year. Okay, moving on. The next plugin that I wanted to mention is the Slate Digital Virtual Mix Rack. So I'll pull that up on the screen here as well. And this is what it looks like. And as you'll notice on the left, you have all these different hardware emulations that you can pull in and into your chain here and move things around and turn them on and off. And it is just a absolutely fantastic plugin. One of the most recent things that they just released is this FG2A right here. This is based on an LA2A opto compressor, and their emulation is just fantastic. It sounds really, really good. I believe I'm actually using that on my bass right now. So I use this on things like my parallel drum bus and bass, as I just mentioned. So that is another absolutely fantastic plugin that I've found to be invaluable. And so these next ones are actually fairly new to me. I just recently discovered them within like the last couple months. And I'm not actually even sure how you say the company's name. It's either OEK Sound or Oak Sound. I'm not sure. Tell me in the comments if you know how to pronounce it. But the two plugins that they make, or at least the ones that I'm using, is Soothe 2 and Spiff. So let me give you an example of Soothe. And so this is Soothe 2. And basically what this does is, given the frequency spectrum that you give it here, so each one of these things is a cue, and then you have the sensitivity and the frequency response and all of that. And so given these cues that you apply, it will automatically detect what are the harsh frequencies that are coming through within this frequency range and pull those down, and to reduce the harshness, right? And it's especially useful on things like guitar, cymbals, stuff like that. And so that's exactly what I'm using it on. I'm using it on guitar, I'm using it on cymbals. And so here's a very quick example of what it does. So what I'm gonna do is, let me just solo the overheads, and then we'll listen to the delta to show you what this thing is doing. So here are the overheads, and then I'm gonna activate the delta so you can hear exactly what it's doing. So what you're hearing there when I activated that delta were the frequencies that it's automatically detected to be, in the harsh range, and it's pulling them down to give me a more smooth sounding cymbal or overhead sound without those harsh frequencies. And so it's fantastic. I absolutely love it. All right, so the next plugin from OEK Sound, or Oak Sound, however you say it, is Spiff. And Spiff is their version of, say, like a transient designer. And so looking at the interface here, it looks very familiar, or very similar rather, to Soothe 2. And so basically the way this works from a high level, I'm not going to go into every single feature, but from a high level, you choose the cues that you want to affect. And so right here, this is actually using, I believe it was Nolly's beefy snare preset that I've just kind of tweaked slightly. And so this is going to boost the lower end frequency of the snare drum. And so I'll solo this snare, and just keep in mind a snare drum soloed without any rooms or anything is going to sound super dry and disgusting. But the point is, I want you to hear what this thing is doing. So here is the snare soloed with Spiff on. Oh, there is some reverb there, so at least you got that. All right, so that's with Spiff on, and then this is with Spiff off. Notice immediately we just lost all that beef, like the low end and the snare, right? So again, here it is with spiff on. Yeah, I mean, it's night and day difference, right? And you can see the frequencies where this is being affected because we have this high and low pass right here to make sure that we're only affecting kind of the lower end frequency spectrum. And so there's a lot of other settings in here. You can affect the decay. The depth is basically how much of the signal is coming through versus the original, so you can kind of blend them together. But overall, Spiff is absolutely fantastic transient designer to really kind of dial in a tone or a sound that you're looking for, given, you know, whether it's drum or whatever. So highly, highly, highly recommend those two plugins. I've found them to be both invaluable. And so Soothe, like I said, I use on guitar and cymbals. Spiff I use on my snare and my parallel drum bus, just to kind of mainly add beef to that snare drum. All right, continuing on with the plugin subcategory of mixing and mastering. Best of 2020 for me is going to be the Shadow Hills Class A mastering compressor. So I use this in my main instrument mix bus as well as mastering if necessary during mastering. So this is you can find this on Plugin Alliance, and I'll pull it up here on the screen, show you what it looks like. It kind of can be overwhelming to look at this thing. It's got so much that you can do with it. The way you can think of this is kind of in three sections. So this very top section up here is the optical compression section, and there's a left and a right channel. You can either have this thing in stereo mode or dual mono. And so that whole top section is the optical compression. Then there's the discrete compression, the discrete section, and there is the bottom section here, which is the Brainworks TMT modeling, as well as stuff like the headroom, the high pass, sidechain filter, mono maker, stereo width, and parallel mix. And so there's a ton you can do with this thing, but I just absolutely love the sound that this thing creates. It does a fantastic job with the compression, but also just the coloration and the actual sound that it produces is amazing. So here's a quick example of with it on, and then I'll turn it off and turn it back on for this little section here. So that gives you a little idea of what it sounds like in this context anyways, with the settings that I have. And as you can see, I'm monitoring the optical and the discrete, and we're getting around maybe 1 dB of gain reduction. So it's not doing a ton, but it is kind of helping bring everything together for this mix. And so I love the sound that it creates. All right, and so the next in my plugins, or really the last plugin that is in my best of 2020 list, is the Adapter Audio Metric AB plugin. Again, from Plugin Alliance. And this is probably one of the best plugins that I've ever used that has helped improve my mixing and mastering by tenfold. It's absolutely an essential going forward for me, and I would highly recommend that you check this out. Or something similar. There are other referencing type plugins out there, but this one is fantastic. So, give you an idea of what it does. You can drop in up to 16 reference tracks. I personally think 16 is too many. Right now I'm only using one. I'll probably add maybe 1 or 2 more as I start to feel like this mix is coming alive and starting to kind of match the reference. And then I'll throw in some additional ones just to kind of try and find a space where I feel like this track fits in versus like directly tries to copy a reference. And so the way that this works is when you're on A, you're listening to your mix. When you're on B, you're on the reference mix. And then, of course, you can, if you have more than one, you can select the reference that you want to A and B back and forth between your mix and that in the reference. And I'll play this back. I'm not going to play the reference track because my video will get a copyright claim if I do, but it's Blood Eagle by Periphery. And so here is my mix, and what you'll see, particularly in this view, is my mix on the top and then the reference mix on the bottom. So here's what it looks like. So it gives you an idea of what sort of frequency spectrum the entire mix looks like, can give you some ideas of areas that maybe you need to bump up or pull down. And so that's something that I found to be very useful. Another one is the stereo image, as well as dynamics and loudness. So overall, this is an absolutely essential plugin for me going forward in both the mixing and mastering context. Absolute best of 2020 for sure. All right, so the next subcategory under mixing and mastering for our best of 2020 is going to be mixing drum techniques. So, or drum mixing techniques, or whatever makes sense. So the first is parallel compression. And this is something that is new to me from earlier this year, starting to kind of look into mixing and different techniques, particularly regarding drums. And parallel compression is something that I learned and have been applying and using ever since. And basically the general idea here is to send your things like your kick, your snare, maybe your toms, out to a parallel bus that has compression, and it's usually a fairly high compression to really add some additional punch. And then using your fader on your bus, you fade it back, you fade that into your overall mix to the point where you can start to hear that come through and add that additional punch, but it's blended in with everything else. And so that is a technique that I have been using ever since discovering it. It has taken my mixes to the next level. Highly recommend you check that out and give it a try. So the next is continuing with the best of drum mixing techniques, is adding saturation. So I use the Black Box HG2, as I mentioned before, on things like the overheads, the rooms, and the toms. And that is actually a practice or a technique that I picked up watching Nolly in one of his masterclass mixing videos, where he was using the FabFilter Saturn on toms, and it really did bring them to life. And so I figured, let me see what happens if I put the Black Box HG2 on the toms, and I thought it worked really well. So I'm not using it to quite the extent that he was using it in that video, but the saturation that I'm adding actually does help bring them to life, and it goes a long ways. So continuing on with our mixing and mastering techniques, next topic is going to be bass. And so really the big thing here is blending a DI bass signal with an amped signal. And so but particularly blending it with a high and a low pass at around 300 hertz. So your crossover is right around 300 hertz. So from 300 hertz up is your amp signal, 300 hertz down is your DI signal. And I will solo this bass right here, and this is what the overall bass tone would sound like. So absolutely sick bass tone. I love this. But here is how we do that. So what we do is we use a DI, we get our DI, and then we do a low pass 300 hertz and down. And so that gives us kind of our sub bass, if you will, right? And so that's what this sounds like. So there's the sub bass. So then we do the exact opposite with our amped bass, which has the distortion. It's going through the amp and the impulse responses and all that. So this is the result here. Right? So we don't want to add all that distortion to the low end. We want that to really kind of add that beef in the bottom end to our mix. If we add the distortion, it's going to lose all that. So we blend it, and again, you end up with this. Absolutely fantastic technique for crafting a awesome low end heavy, but also brutal and distorted sounding bass tone. So give that a try as well. And the last for bass is going to be using the stock Logic pedal board and the bass amp designer. So as I mentioned before, I do use Gin Bass, and it does come with like an amped version of the output from the plugin, so you can add a distortion automatically, and honestly, it sounds fantastic as is. But I figured, let me try and see what I can craft using the DI output of Gin Bass into something else. And I found that the grit pedal in the stock Logic pedal board with the Logic Bass Amp Designer is absolutely amazing, and it sounds awesome. And that's what you just heard, is the grit pedal with the Logic Bass Amp through that amped section of the bass. And so it sounds fantastic. So I'm calling that part of my best of 2020 for crafting a bass tone. All right, so moving on, mixing and mastering best of 2020 for guitar. So the first thing is, do not try and craft or build your guitar tone out of context. And what I mean by that is just sitting in front of your speakers with your amp sim and just trying to build the perfect tone that you think you're going to drop into a mix and it's going to be perfect. That is very unlikely to happen. It's out of context. You're not hearing it blending with, the other frequencies that your bass, your kick drum, your snare drum, your cymbals, your room mics, your vocalist, if you have a singer, like you're not hearing it blended with all of those other things. So it could really either not sit well or stick out in places you don't want it to. So go ahead and start crafting something out of context. Use that to kind of get you part of the way there, to kind of start getting something that you like. Then track some stuff, put it in context in your mix, and do the rest there, so that you're really hearing it in context. And that's going to give you a much better tone that sits in your mix. So that's the first thing as far as mixing and mastering techniques best of 2020 for guitar. The last thing really is finding an impulse response that complements your amp. And I will give a shout out here to Miko from ML Sound Lab. He has a video out on his YouTube channel, which goes into much greater detail than I'm about to. But the high level here is different amps have a different sound or frequency spectrum to them, where it could sound either more of a scooped tone or less of a scooped tone and have more mid sound, more of a mid-range tone. So you want an impulse response that's going to have kind of the opposite frequency spectrum or response. So if you're using an amp that has more of a scooped tone, then use an impulse response that has more of a mid-range response to it, and vice versa. And that's going to help you build a more or craft a more well-rounded and complete tone, versus something that's going to be just like ultra scooped because you're using a scooped amp with a scooped IR, or ultra mid-range heavy because you're using a mid-range heavy amp with a mid-range heavy IR. So that is a technique I did not know anything about earlier this year, learned it this year, have been using it to build custom tones, and it's taken my guitar tones to the next level, especially in context. The very last topic I wanted to point out on this video, as far as my best of 2020 or things that I've learned or discovered this year, is using reference tracks. So I've already mentioned the Adapter Audio Metric AB plugin for quickly referencing your mix or quickly switching from your mix to a reference track. And I can't recommend that enough. If you go back and watch any of the videos from earlier this year when I started this channel, you will hear that my mixes are total garbage. They sound like crap. The drums are lifeless and boxy. There's hardly any rooms in them at all. There's no top end whatsoever. There's no air. There's no breath to this, to the sound, to the mixes. They just overall are bad, and it's because of a couple things. The first thing is I did not have a good monitoring setup. So if you're not using some halfway decent monitors, that's the first problem, and I wasn't. But even more so than using better monitors. Because if you listen to enough through any monitor, if you listen to enough music for long enough through them, you can start to understand how to mix through those, right? Like you ask any professional engineer, you don't necessarily have to have the best, most expensive studio setup. If you have listened to something through it enough and learn, and you've adapted your ear to the sound of that equipment, you can get by. But more so, it's having something to reference, right? So having a reference or multiple references as you're mixing and mastering is going to really take things to the next level, and it absolutely did for me. And I cannot say enough about using references while you're mixing and mastering. And tools like the Adapter Audio Metric AB are essential and absolutely going to be in my workflows going forward. All right, so now that I've gone through all of my best of 2020, I want to go ahead and show you kind of my mastering setup and also give you an example of the Get Good Drums, the Invasion, the Submission Audio Gin Bass, STL Amp Hub with the 5153 Amp Sim paired with the Bogren Digital Rhythm IR Pack IRs, and show you what all of those things sound like in context in a full mix in my mastering setup right here. And I'll show you some of the plugins that I use that I've already gone over and how I use them in a mastering setup. So first thing is I figured I'll just go through the entire signal chain that I have in this mastering setup here. And the first thing is the Slate Digital Fresh Air plugin. And this thing is really great at adding a lot of really pristine top end, air to your mix, without it being harsh as they touted on the website. And so I don't use it extensively. Like, I don't use a ton. I don't crank things up here, but obviously that's dependent on the mix. And for this mix, I just felt like these settings here really worked well to kind of add some crystal clear top end to this mix. So here's an example of what it sounds like without anything on. And then here's what it sounds like with the fresh air on. So you can really hear how that starts to bring that top end to life and add that clarity. So that is the fresh air. The next up is the Slate Digital Infinity EQ. And this is adding a couple boosts as well as a small cut. And this is all basically a result of using references, and specifically the Adapter Audio Metric AB plugin, and comparing it to some references. And I found that overall, this mix was just lacking some additional bottom end beef as well as some top end clarity as compared to the references. So here is what it sounds like without this EQ, and then I'll turn it on. So immediately you can hear that bottom end really start to come through, that bottom end beef, as well as the top end, and you start getting some more clarity in the cymbals, the kick drum, the snare drum, all of it. So that is where we're at so far. The next up is one of my best of 2020 plugins, and that is the Black Box HG2 saturation plugin. And so I don't use this too much. As you can see, like with the pentode, it's pulled back quite a ways. Saturation is kind of up a little high, but because the pentode is pulled back, it's not adding a ton to this mix. It's just to kind of add some additional coloration and saturation. And you can see I'm actually mixing that at 40%. So here's what it sounds like without, and then I'll add it. Very subtle, but it's there. It adds that nice saturation and coloration. So continuing on is the Shadow Hills Mastering Compressor. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video when I was talking about this is only kind of on an as needed basis. And you'll notice when I turn this on, it's very, very subtle. I think it's maybe pulling back like maybe half a dB to 1 dB max. And in a mastering setup, that's all I want to be doing at max. And this is really just to kind of help duck things just a little bit with the snare, because I found it was just overpowering just a little bit. And so here's what it sounds like without, and then I'll turn it on, and I want to warn you that the volume is going to increase a little bit here. So there you go. This thing adds a beautiful characteristic to the overall sound, a beautiful coloration, on top of being an absolutely awesome compressor. So obviously a best of plugin right there. And then the Slate Digital FGX. And this is basically only being used as kind of like a limiter, or I'm not sure if it's technically a limiter or a clipper, but I think it's more of a limiter. But it's basically allows me to up the volume to something like a professional production, right? So as I'm listening to these references and seeing where their volumes are, I can match that using this leveler. And so this is where I want to throw out a huge warning that if you're listening, especially on headphones, and you have your volume turned up, you're going to want to turn it down now, because this is going to increase the volume quite a bit. So here is what this does. So not only does it bring up the level, but it also has things like this ITP, which I have pulled up slightly to hard. And it actually adds, I don't remember what ITP stands for, but it adds kind of some clipping, if you will, some additional saturation to kind of the top end, as well as I've pulled up the dynamic perception a little bit. And that just kind of helps, well, exactly as it says, dynamic perception, right? So it doesn't all just kind of sound one level. There's some dynamics, some dynamicism to the sound. And I usually just leave the low punch and detail as is pulled off. I usually do kind of more EQing than I do using their transient designer in here. And so that's my mastering setup. And as you'll see here, I'm obviously using the Adapter Audio AB to switch between my master and a professional mastered production track, flipping back and forth to see what it sounds like. And here what I'll do is I'll show you the spectrum analyzer just to kind of show you with all of the plugins that I've turned on how closely this is matching the reference now. That's really, really close. And so if I turn off all of the plugins, you'll hear the massive difference, and also look at the spectrum analyzer difference. So there you go. That is my mastering setup, and that hopefully gives you an idea of what the Get Good Drums, the Invasion, the Gin Bass sounds like, the STL Amp Hub, all of those things that I've described previously, what they sound like in context in a full, semi-professionally mastered production track. All right, and that is going to wrap up my best of 2020. I hope you found this useful. I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe you learned a new technique or discovered a new plugin here that you can utilize yourself. And if so, then my purpose is fulfilled here. That's exactly what I wanted to do, is just share what I've learned with y'all so you can continue improving yourself. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. If you enjoyed this content, if you enjoyed my channel, hit subscribe. It's right down below. It would mean the world to me. Hit like, hit share, tell someone else about this content or this channel. Maybe they would dig it too. Hit me in the comments with any additional thoughts you may have. And as always, thank you for watching. Have an awesome, happy new year, and I will see you in 2021.